My parents withdrew $250,000 I had saved for 10 years to buy a home. When I confronted them, Dad smirked. Your brother needed it more. Days later, I couldn't stop laughing because the account they emptied was— If you'd asked me 10 years ago what success looked like, I wouldn't have described yachts or private jets. No, my definition of success was far more modest and apparently far more offensive to my family. All I wanted was a small house with creaky floors, a kitchen with enough space for a coffee machine that wasn't secondhand, and a front door no one else had a key to. So I started saving. At 22, I opened a high-yield savings account with the kind of reverence most people reserve for religious artifacts. The bank teller even congratulated me as if I had done something miraculous. I guess in hindsight, maybe I had, because over the next decade, I did something my family considered borderline heretical. I said no. No to vacations. No to new cars. No to dinners where Aiden would inevitably say, "Bro, can you cover me? My startup funds are just in a little holding pattern." A holding pattern. Translation, he spent the last of his investor money on an NFT shaped like a ferret in a bow tie. I watched friends take trips to Greece, buy condos, and host engagement parties in rooftop bars. Meanwhile, I bought groceries with coupons and learned exactly how many meals I could stretch out of a sack of rice and frozen broccoli. Every dollar was a step closer to freedom. And every family gathering was a reminder that my freedom was apparently everyone else's emergency fund. My mother never failed to twist the knife. You know, Ethan, it's wonderful that you're so disciplined, she'd say, her tone coated in something sticky and sweet. But money is for sharing. We help each other in this family, right? Except each other always meant me helping Aiden. Aiden with his brilliant ideas and his complete inability to hold a job longer than the lifespan of a housefly. Aiden once told me I was too uptight about money, as though financial stability were a personal failing. I'd learned to smile through it. I'd learned to let them believe I was naive, because, in their eyes, I was always the boring one, the dependable one, the ATM with a heartbeat. And I didn't care, because I had a plan. Every night, I logged into my bank account and watched the numbers climb. $50,000, $100,000, $150,000. By the time I reached $250,000, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt relief. That money wasn't just money. It was proof that I could choose my own life. No matter how many times my father rolled his eyes and called me obsessive, and no matter how many lectures I endured about family loyalty, I had done it anyway. I had built something that belonged to me, and that terrified them. I know this now because while I was busy believing my discipline would keep me safe, they were busy proving me wrong. If you'd asked me then whether my family would ever cross that line and take what wasn't theirs, I would have laughed. No matter how transactional they were, I still believed there was a line they wouldn't cross. It turned out that the only naive thing about me was believing they had limits. The day I learned exactly how wrong I was became the day I stopped caring what they thought. Being the designated responsible one had always felt like a compliment, right up until my family realized that responsibility made me easy to exploit. It started innocently enough. The calls from my mother sounded like small talk, but they always circled back to one thing. How are you managing all that money, Ethan? The first time she asked, I thought she was genuinely curious, as though maybe she was finally proud of me. I remember sitting on the couch with my laptop open to a house listing I couldn't quite afford yet, smiling like an idiot. It's going well, I told her. I'm thinking I'll start seriously shopping for a place by the end of the year. Oh. She made a small hum in the back of her throat. Are you sure you're not putting all your eggs in one basket? Markets can turn, you know. I should have recognized it then. That tone sounded as though she were planting a seed of doubt to soften me up for the inevitable request. But I wanted so badly to believe she was simply worried. That was the first sign. The second sign came when Aiden called me at 11:45 p.m. on a Tuesday. Ethan, hey, he said, his voice full of manufactured urgency. Listen, I've been going over some numbers and I think I've solved this funding problem. I said, because I knew exactly where the conversation was going. I just need a bridge, he continued, a short-term loan, A partnership, really. And since you're so good with your finances, there it was. Aiden had mastered the art of making a financial bailout sound like a collaboration. I told him no. I told him I was saving for something important. I told him he should talk to a bank. And he did what he always did when I refused. He sighed dramatically and said, "God, you're so obsessed with hoarding. It's honestly sad." Then he hung up. I remember sitting in the dark afterward, the glow of my laptop screen illuminating the number in my account. $243,811.46. I felt something shift, like a crack forming in the wall between me and them. I told myself everything was fine. They were only frustrated. No one would actually do something as insane as take what wasn't theirs. Then the third sign came, and it wasn't subtle. One Saturday afternoon, I logged into my account to transfer a little extra into my savings, but the login screen had changed. There were new security questions I hadn't created and a new backup email address I'd never seen. My stomach dropped. I reset the password, my heart hammering so hard it felt as though my ribs might crack. When I finally got back in, everything looked normal. The same balance, the same transactions. But there was an alert in the corner that read, "Recent changes to account permissions." I called the bank and spent 37 minutes on hold. A woman named Jenna finally picked up. "Yes, it looks like a new authorized user was added last week," she said, her tone brisk, as though this were perfectly ordinary. "What name?" I asked. There was a pause. "A Mr. Daniel Carter." My father. My mouth went dry. I don't remember exactly what I said to her. Something about removing him immediately. Something about changing every password and security question. Something about mailing me physical statements because I no longer trusted anything digital. When I finally hung up, I sat there in silence trying to understand the logic of it. I couldn't understand how anyone could raise a child to believe in hard work and then decide that child's hard work belonged to them. I couldn't understand how anyone could look at one son's future and see nothing but spare parts for the favored child's ambitions. It was the first time I wondered whether my father had ever seen me as anything more than a contingency plan. And it was the first time I realized that if they were willing to do this, they might be willing to do anything. I'd love to say I handled it with grace. I'd love to say I took a deep breath, thought everything through, and calmly assessed my options like a grown adult. But the truth was that when I logged in again 2 weeks later and saw the balance, I felt as though the floor had vanished beneath me. $7,129. That was it. I had gone from believing I had nearly $250,000 to staring at an amount that wouldn't even cover my rent for the next month. At first, I thought it had to be a mistake, a glitch, a failure in the app. I refreshed the page so many times that my fingers cramped. I called the bank again, my voice shaking so badly that I had to repeat my name 3 times before they understood me. Jenna, using the same calm, unfazed voice, explained that the transfer had been made by the authorized user, my father. She called it a consolidation of assets, as though she were reading from a recipe. I asked whether she understood what she was saying. "That was my entire life," I told her, my voice flat and hollow. She didn't answer because what could she possibly say? I don't know how long I sat there after I ended the call. It was long enough for the sun to move across the floor, painting a rectangle of light that looked like a doorway to somewhere I would never be able to afford now. I pressed my palms against my temples and felt the edges of something unspooling inside my head. I thought about every time I'd said no. I thought about all the years I convinced myself I was safe because I was careful. I thought about all the birthdays I'd spent alone so I could put another $500 into that account. All gone. I wanted to call someone, but I didn't have anyone to call. The irony was so sharp that it almost made me laugh. For years, I'd been determined not to need anyone, so no one would ever be able to take anything from me. And in the end, the only people I trusted were the people who took it all. I remember staring at the screen, my heartbeat a dull thump behind my eyes, and thinking, this is what betrayal looks like. Not some huge cinematic moment, not a dramatic argument or a slammed door, just a number on a screen that is smaller than it was the day before. I shut the laptop with my hands trembling. For 1 second, just one, I imagined driving to my parents' house and screaming at them. I imagined telling them that they had broken something inside me that I didn't know how to repair. But even in my fantasies, they didn't care. Even in my imagination, my father shrugged while my mother dabbed at her eyes and accused me of overreacting. I stood up, went into the bathroom, splashed water on my face, and looked into the mirror. I didn't recognize myself. I looked older and exhausted, like a man who had traded 10 years of his life for nothing. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was knowing they would never believe they had done anything wrong. They would call it family. They would call it love. And they would sleep perfectly well. I knew then that I had to confront them. If I didn't, I would spend the rest of my life allowing them to define me. And I'd already wasted enough time. I didn't bother calling ahead. If I'd given them any warning, they would have prepared a dozen excuses, each one more patronizing than the last. So I drove straight to their house, a bland suburban colonial with shutters that hadn't been painted since Aiden's second bankruptcy, and marched up the steps without knocking. I swung the door open so hard that it rattled. My father looked up from his recliner as though I'd interrupted an important summit instead of an afternoon nap. "Ethan," he said, his voice bored, "you could have called." I could have, but the expression on his face when he realized I knew was worth every mile of that drive. "Where is it?" I asked, my voice so steady that it startled even me. He didn't pretend not to understand. He simply lifted his glass, always filled with cheap scotch, and took a sip. "Where's what?" he drawled. "My money." Aiden appeared in the hallway, looking exactly like a man who had been handed everything and still found a way to ruin it. "Oh, this is about that," he said, scratching the back of his neck. "Look, it's not what you think." "Really?" I cut in, my voice rising. "Because I think you took $250,000 from me." My mother appeared behind him, clutching the edges of her cardigan like a life vest. "Don't be so dramatic," she sighed. "It's family money, Ethan." The words landed like a slap. Family money. They said it as though I hadn't skipped meals to save, as though I hadn't rejected every opportunity to live because I believed the promise that discipline would eventually buy me freedom. My father placed his glass on the table and leaned back. His smirk was so casual that it made my hands shake. "You should be thanking us," he said. "Your money has now secured your brother's bright future." I blinked. For a second, I wondered whether I'd imagined the words, but no, he was looking directly into my eyes, daring me to disagree. Aiden had the nerve to look sheepish. "It's just a loan," he said. "Once the project gets going—" "Don't." I didn't trust myself to say anything more. My father sighed as though he were the victim. "You've always been so naive," he said, his tone dripping with disdain. "Did you really think you could hoard all that money and we'd simply sit by? That's not how family works." He actually chuckled, as though he were explaining something obvious to a dim-witted child. Heat rushed into my face, and my heart pounded against my ribs. There it was, the truth I'd never allowed myself to look at directly. They didn't love me, not the way I'd always hoped. They respected what I could give them. They tolerated my existence because it was convenient. And the moment it stopped being convenient, they were willing to strip my life apart without a flicker of guilt. I looked around the living room. Framed photographs showed Aiden at every milestone. In every place where my achievement should have appeared, there was only empty space. Something inside me finally snapped. I laughed. It wasn't a normal laugh. It was the kind of laughter heard in hospital waiting rooms at 3 in the morning. Too loud, too sharp, carrying more despair than humor. My mother flinched. My father's smirk faltered. And in that tiny moment of confusion, I realized I was finished being their safety net. I was finished pretending we had ever been a real family. I wiped my eyes and stood straight. "You have no idea what you've done," I said. For the first time in my life, I meant those words as a promise. Then I turned and walked out. I didn't look back. If I had, I think I would have lost my nerve, but I didn't. I closed the door behind me and allowed the cold autumn air to swallow me whole. Even through the shock and grief, something else was beginning to grow inside my chest, a cold, bright certainty. This was the last time they would ever take a piece of me. I didn't drive straight home. I didn't even know where I was going. I simply kept turning onto different roads until my hands stopped shaking. When I finally pulled over, I was sitting in front of a gas station on Route 41, the kind of place that sold 40-day-old hot dogs and scratch-off tickets no one ever won. I sat there with the engine ticking and watched the neon sign flicker in and out. Then I laughed again. It was quieter this time, but no less raw, because the absurdity of everything hit me all at once. I'd given up nearly everything for a decade so I could build a life on my own terms. And in the end, I was right back where I'd started. Exhausted, alone, broke. But for the first time, it didn't feel like the end. It felt like clarity. Because once I saw the truth and really looked it in the eye, there was no going back. I sat there for a long time while the cold slowly crept into the car. Then my phone buzzed. It was a text from Emma. "You okay?" I stared at the message and felt something tighten in my throat. Emma was the only person I'd ever trusted with the real numbers and the real plan. She was the only person who had never tried to make me feel small for wanting something simple. I typed back, "No, can I come over?" Her reply appeared instantly. "Always." I started the engine and drove to her apartment. When she opened the door, she didn't ask any questions. She simply pulled me into a hug so tight that it knocked the last of the panic out of my chest. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. For a moment, I allowed myself to feel all of it. The anger, the humiliation, the dull ache of 10 years dissolving overnight. But beneath everything, something else was beginning to spark. Not despair, not fear, resolve. While I stood beneath the water in Emma's tiny bathroom, I thought about my father's smug expression. "Thanks for your naivety." The words replayed inside my head like a scratched record. The more I heard them, the less they sounded like an insult, and the more they sounded like a challenge. When I came out, Emma was sitting cross-legged on the floor with her laptop open. "Okay," she said, her eyes sharper than I'd ever seen them. "Walk me through everything, every login, every transaction, every document. We're going to find out exactly what they did." I almost laughed again, but this time it was from relief, because in that moment, I knew I wasn't alone. We stayed awake until 2 in the morning. Emma clicked through account statements while I dictated names and dates. At some point, she got up and made coffee strong enough to strip paint from the walls. I drank it anyway. Somewhere between the third and fourth mug, I realized I was finished being the family scapegoat. I was finished being the responsible one whose only reward was getting picked clean. I was tired of feeling ashamed for wanting my own life. I was tired of apologizing for not being Aiden. So I stopped. Just like that. I looked up from the spreadsheet with my chest feeling tight and hollow. "They're never getting another piece of me," I said. Emma nodded as though she'd been waiting for me to say it. "Good," she said softly, "because you deserve better." For the first time since that nightmare of a bank call, I actually believed her. The cold fire inside me wasn't going away. It was settling into something steady. Not rage, not grief. Something cleaner. Determination. They thought they had taken everything, but they had forgotten the most important thing. I was still here, and I wasn't finished. I'd always believed that taking my money was the worst thing my family could ever do to me. I was wrong, because the real nightmare began when Emma and I started peeling back the layers. We turned our kitchen table into a command center. Laptops covered one side, printouts covered the other, yellow highlighters bled across bank statements like crime scene tape. It was almost unbelievable how quickly a pattern appeared. At first, all we saw was the single transfer that had drained my savings. Then we noticed the shell companies. There were 3 of them, all carrying names so bland that no one would ever look twice. Stonebridge Consulting, Apex Synergy, Horizon Strategies. They sounded respectable. Every one of them was registered to the same post office box inside a strip mall 2 towns away. And the primary contact listed on every document was my father. "My father," I said. "Jesus," Emma breathed. "Did you know he was doing this?" "No." My voice sounded distant inside my own ears. "I didn't." Aiden's name appeared too, printed across half a dozen invoices marked consulting fees. Consulting on what? How to spend money faster than a reckless gambler. Every click uncovered something worse. My identity had been used as collateral on a line of credit I had never applied for. My signature, poorly copied like something a teenager had practiced in the dark, appeared on at least 2 loan documents. It felt surreal. I was sitting in Emma's cheerful apartment with a tiny ceramic cat resting on the windowsill, realizing that the people who raised me had spent years quietly building a structure designed to make me the person blamed when everything collapsed. They didn't just take your money, Emma said, her face pale. They took your name. I pressed the heels of my hands against my eyes and tried to force back the nausea. All those late nights, all those paychecks I'd saved, all that self-denial so I could finally have something that belonged only to me. And in the end, they had taken it anyway, along with a few I owe us created in my name for good measure. I'm going to be ruined, I whispered. Emma placed her hand over mine. No, she said firmly, you're not. But I could see uncertainty inside her eyes. It was small and flickering, but it was real. That uncertainty lit something inside me that I hadn't felt before. It wasn't hot, explosive anger. This feeling was cold, clean, surgical. It came from the knowledge that no one was coming to save me. If I wanted to escape this, I would have to dismantle their mess myself. We spent the entire night cataloging everything, screenshots of every transfer, PDF copies of every forged document, a spreadsheet listing every shell company, every date, and every amount. At dawn, Emma made more coffee while I stared at the growing pile of evidence with my heart hammering. They thought they had won. They thought I would crawl back to them humiliated and grateful for whatever crumbs of forgiveness they decided to offer. But as I studied the paper trail, which was so careless that it almost felt insulting, I realized something that made me laugh out loud. It was a jagged, exhausted sound. They were greedy, they were careless, and they were arrogant enough to believe they would never be caught. That was their mistake, and I was going to make sure the consequences reached them. The strange thing about arrogance is that it makes people sloppy. They were so certain they had stripped me bare that they never imagined I had prepared for this possibility. I hadn't told anyone, not even Emma, that 2 months earlier I'd become nervous. The economy was unstable, my parents were acting more anxious than usual, and something inside my gut had whispered, "Move the money." So I did. I opened a separate account at a credit union 2 counties away. It was quiet and old-fashioned with no online access. There was only a passbook and my signature on file. Then I transferred nearly everything. $240,000. I left only enough in the original account to keep it active. It was a decoy balance designed to make everyone believe my entire nest egg was still there. The money they had actually taken was the $10,000 I'd left behind. Compared with what they believed they had taken, it was almost nothing. But that wasn't the realization that made me laugh until my ribs hurt. As Emma and I cross-referenced the shell company deposits, the dates aligned in a way that was too precise to be accidental. The day they emptied my decoy account was the same day they moved money through those dummy corporations. As we continued digging, we discovered that those funds could be traced back to fraudulent loans created in my name. In their rush to collect what they believed was my life savings, they had accidentally taken their own laundered money and left behind a paper trail so obvious that even a half-blind accountant could have followed it. I pressed my palms against my forehead while adrenaline buzzed through me like static electricity. "They took their own trap," I whispered. Emma blinked. "Say that again?" "They didn't get my money," I said. "They got their own, and now the banks think I was involved." It was almost poetic. My father's voice echoed inside my head. "Thanks for your naivety." I wanted to call him and say, "Actually, Dad, it turns out I was smarter than you believed." But I didn't. Instead, I sat there feeling something I hadn't felt in weeks. Leverage. I no longer had only proof that they had taken money. I had proof of an entire conspiracy. The copied signatures, the fraudulent loans, the shell companies, the receipts proving that the money they had removed was never mine to begin with. Their entire operation was a house of cards, and I was standing beside it with a box fan. Emma closed her laptop, her eyes wide. "This is bigger than your savings," she said. I nodded. "It's their entire scheme, and if we give this to the right people, everything will come apart." The possibility tasted like justice. It also tasted like fear, because if this was going to end, I would have to walk away from every last connection to them. But as I sat there, exhausted, furious, and more alive than I'd felt in years, I realized something simple. They had already destroyed our connection the moment they decided my life was worth less than Aiden's next idea. All I was doing was making sure the consequences finally reached them. I didn't sleep the night we completed the dossier. While Emma double-checked every date and attachment, I sat on her worn-out couch and stared at the ceiling fan turning in slow circles. I wondered what my father would say when he realized he was no longer the smartest person in the room. We printed everything. Hundreds of pages. Every document was labeled, organized, and cross-referenced. At sunrise, we loaded everything into a box and drove to the nearest FBI field office. I'd never stepped inside a place like that. It looked exactly the way I'd imagined. Neutral gray walls, somber suits, a silence that felt more like judgment than calm. The clerk behind the counter raised her eyebrows as I carried the box of evidence toward her. "Can I help you?" she asked, sounding somewhere between suspicious and intrigued. "Yes," I said, finally finding my voice. "I'd like to report a large-scale identity theft and financial fraud scheme. The primary suspects are my parents." She didn't blink. Instead, she gestured toward a chair. "Wait here." We waited for an hour. When the agent finally came out, he looked as though he were in his mid-40s. His hairline was receding, and his face carried an expression that suggested he had seen every form of human betrayal. He didn't waste any time. He led us into a small conference room containing a battered table and chairs that creaked whenever anyone breathed too hard. "Walk me through it," he said. So we did. We explained every detail, every forged document, every transfer, every time my father had signed my name as though it belonged to him. By the time we finished, the agent had worked through 3 legal pads. He released a long, tired breath. "You realize," he said slowly, "this isn't simply a family disagreement. This is federal fraud, identity theft, and potentially money laundering." I nodded. "I realize. I also realize that if nothing is done, they'll do it to me again, or they'll do it to someone else." He studied me for a long moment. Then he said the words that finally allowed my heart to unclench. "We'll handle it from here." 3 weeks later, it happened. There was no huge scene, no Hollywood drama, just 3 unmarked cars pulling up outside my parents' house on a rainy Thursday morning. I wasn't there, but Emma was. She watched from inside her car across the street. When my phone rang, her voice was low, steady, and more satisfied than I'd ever heard it. "They're taking them into custody," she said. "Both?" I asked. "Both." I closed my eyes, while a wave of relief and something darker moved through me. "Are they saying anything?" "Oh, yes," Emma replied. "Your father looks like he's trying to lecture the agents. Your mother is crying." I didn't feel sorry for them. I didn't feel triumphant either. I simply felt finished, like the part of me that had spent a lifetime waiting for their approval had finally gone quiet. Later, when the official statement arrived through my lawyer, its language was satisfyingly clinical. The suspects had been taken into custody for questioning, related to multiple counts of fraud, wire transfers across state lines, and identity theft. There it was. The entire rotten structure they had built was collapsing inside a few short paragraphs. I thought I would feel guilty for pressing charges against my own parents. But as I lay in bed that night, listening to rain tap against the window, all I felt was something I hadn't experienced in years. Peace. They thought they had destroyed me, but they had only freed me. 6 months earlier, I would have laughed at the idea that I would become the reason my parents were indicted. But when the dust settled and their booking photographs appeared on local news websites beneath the words, "Family Fraud Ring Uncovered," I didn't laugh. I simply felt tired. Aiden, unsurprisingly, was the first person to reappear. He launched an online campaign against me that was so melodramatic it read like a rejected reality show script. My vindictive brother turned on his own family. he posted, conveniently forgetting that his name appeared in half the subpoenas. He tried to portray me as an ungrateful parasite who owed everything to the people who raised me. That accusation was especially rich coming from a man who once borrowed my car for a meeting and returned 2 days later smelling like tequila and regret. At first, I considered responding. I thought about posting all the evidence, the timelines, the notarized affidavit proving every word was true. But Emma reminded me of something important. You don't owe them an explanation, she said. Let them scream into the void. So I did the most difficult thing I'd ever done. Nothing. I didn't engage. I didn't defend myself. I didn't explain. I allowed the facts to speak for themselves. And they did. Within a month, the legal filings became public records. The press discovered the story. Suddenly, Aiden's hashtags about brotherly betrayal didn't look very convincing beside copies of forged loan agreements carrying my signature. My extended family fractured. Some cousins sent polite, cautious messages. Others sided with my parents and accused me of destroying everything. I stopped responding to all of them because the truth was simple. They had destroyed themselves. And for the first time, nothing was tying me to them. 2 months after the arrests, I did something I dreamed about since I was 22. I bought a house. It wasn't large, it was simply a small craftsman bungalow, with a crooked mailbox and a garden overrun with dandelions. But when the realtor handed me the keys, my hands were steady. No more second-guessing, no more apologizing. I stood inside the empty living room and listened to the floorboards creak beneath my feet. Then I exhaled. I was home. Not because someone had given it to me, not because I'd been lucky, because I'd fought for it. When I turned the key inside the front door for the first time, it felt like closing a chapter I'd been trapped inside my entire life. I was no longer the responsible one. I was no longer the fallback plan. I was no longer the naive son who allowed everyone to take whatever they wanted. I was simply Ethan. A man who had survived something unimaginable and reached the other side with his life still belonging to him. They thought they had taken my future. In reality, they had only taken their own. People love a redemption story. They want everything to end with some huge sentimental moment. They imagine me forgiving everyone, embracing Aiden in a courthouse hallway, and promising that we will all begin again. But real life isn't a Hallmark movie. Real life is quieter, messier, more honest. 6 months after moving into the bungalow, I was still unpacking boxes I hadn't dared to open in years. There were old photographs, birthday cards with my name misspelled, a stack of letters from my father with the word responsibility underlined as though it were a threat. I almost threw them away. Instead, I placed everything inside a folder labeled evidence. Not because I planned to use those things, but because I never wanted to forget. It wasn't bitterness. It was a reminder. I would never allow myself to be that trusting again. My therapist was a soft-spoken man named Harris, who always smelled like peppermint. During one session, he asked whether I regretted pressing charges. I didn't hesitate. No, I said. I regret allowing everything to continue for so long. The truth is that there were 100 moments when I could have drawn a line, but I didn't. I kept believing that if I worked harder, saved more, and remained patient, my family would eventually see me as something more than a wallet. That was the most dangerous lie of all. It took losing everything to understand that my worth had never been open for negotiation. So I built new boundaries around my life, like walls. No more surprise visits. No more calls that were supposedly just to talk. No more guilt disguised as love. Some people tried to shame me for those boundaries. But they're still your parents, they would say, their voices dripping with judgment. And I would smile, just a little, before answering. And I'm still their son, but I'm not their property. That spring, I planted a small vegetable garden in the backyard. I watched the tomatoes rise from the soil and grow bright and defiant. Emma came over every Sunday carrying fresh bread and a bottle of cheap wine. We sat together on the porch and talked about nothing and everything. Sometimes late at night, I stood beside the window and thought about all the versions of myself I had left behind. The boy who believed sacrifice would buy love. The young man who mistook manipulation for family. The adult who believed boundaries were selfish. I grieved for every one of them, but I didn't miss them. The man I had become wasn't afraid anymore. I didn't need anyone's permission to exist. I didn't need approval from people who had never seen me as an equal. I was free. The last time I checked the news, my parents were awaiting sentencing. Aiden had disappeared into whatever corner of the internet still believed his delusions. And I was exactly where I wanted to be, quiet, at peace, building something that would never be taken from me again. The freedom, the authenticity, the hard-won peace. I had finally learned that they were priceless.